People say that writing is a lonely business, but I disagree. You have many, many people around you. It's just a question of how many you want to write. You see, some writers plan out every little step of the story before they ever start writing. I'm not like that. I start with a plan, yeah, but the story just kind of writes itself if I'm lucky. I've never had any desire to take a laptop for a walk and write in a cafe. I work on an old desktop computer at the desk in my study. Sometimes I sit in front of my computer, and the whole thing just comes to me, intact, with almost no thought. All I really have to do is transcribe it. It's like I'm channeling someone else's life. Alright, sometimes I have to work hard on a plot, build a story bit by bit, but that's not common, and when I do that, the story usually is rubbish anyway. 2 weeks ago, I got a commission, write a story, 5,000 words or so, on a serial killer. Not really my field. I usually write romances. That's where the money is. But, a commission is easy money, no need to chase up editors, so I said I'd take it. The genre is different, but the writing process, for me, was the same. I set up a one-page outline and then started to fill in the details. The trick is to set up the situation and then to let the characters develop organically. That way, they come out as real people. Their personality comes out in their actions. Sometimes you have to go back and modify some early stuff once you've seen who they really are, but not often. This one's on a serial killer, but I let him develop the same way. As I write the first scene, I find out that he's intelligent, brilliant, highly sarcastic, and has no genuine empathy. He knows how to manipulate others, but he doesn't care about their feelings one little bit. Great. Perfect. Sounds like the right guy for the job. He makes his first kill, at least the first kill in this story. I don't have the words for how I felt. It was terrible. The scene flowed from my fingers onto the keyboard, as so much of my writing does. But the carnage, the violence, the things he did to that poor girl. And he enjoyed it. He was proud of his creativity, of how much pain he could inflict before she finally passed. I finished the scene and pushed my chair back from the desk, feeling physically sick. How could I have written that? What depraved part of my subconscious produced such a sickening and violent description? I read it again, intending to delete it. It was my writing all right. I recognized my style. I would even say it was some of my best work. The description was perfect, and the characters were written so realistically. It still made me sick to read it, but I couldn't delete it, not something that dramatic and compelling. I couldn't write any more that evening. I went downstairs and poured a generous glass of whiskey. I deadened my mind with the scotch and TV. My sleep that night, though, was not easy. My dreams were filled with inventive ways to kill people, and it was me making the killing. I woke early, half expecting to see my hands covered in blood. They weren't, of course. I told myself, over my first coffee, that dreams and fiction are not reality. I went back to the story after lunch. I do other work, editing and so on, in the mornings. The main character was still reveling in his kill. He celebrated it. He thought of it as a work of art. He loved the thought that his work would affect others, fear, loathing, and perhaps admiration. I stopped to reread the page I'd written and come to a shuddering halt. There, in his train of consciousness, he said, "I've invaded the dreams of the author, improving them, no doubt." Had I written that? I didn't remember doing it, but so often, when I write, it just comes out, uncensored, uncontrolled. I looked back along with the paragraph. The sentence fitted, it matched his style, his thinking. I couldn't leave it in, though. I deleted it and sort of tidied up the paragraph. It didn't flow. It wasn't as good, but it would do. Again, I decided to stop writing for the day. While the work was flowing, it was not coming out the way I wanted. It was turning more into a self-congratulatory passage by the killer. This is not how I wanted it to go. I grabbed a glass of scotch again and sat down in front of the TV to go over my notes. I'd have to tighten up my plan to make this work better. The news was playing in the background while I worked. I heard the term gruesome murder and figured I should pay attention. I might learn something about real killers. My mouth fell open, and I dropped my pen. As far as they could report the details on the TV, the crime seemed the same as the one I had written the day before. The victim, the location, and the publicly released details all matched. I sat back in my seat and took a deep swig of my scotch. It burned down my throat, dragging me back to reality. A coincidence, that was all. If I could see the unreleased information, there'd be many differences. I mean, let's face it, serial killers tend to target younger women and do their deeds in abandoned factories. That's why I wrote the scene, it was close to reality. Art imitates life. Right? Not the other way around. This story was getting into my head. I wasn't comfortable with it, and I played, briefly, with the idea of telling the client I couldn't do it. But, I had a reputation to protect. I'd never failed to turn out a story yet, and I wasn't going to now. No. Tomorrow I would wrap this up. I grabbed my notes and started altering them. One more kill. He is a serial killer after all, and then he gets his comeuppance. That's it. It would be all done and finished. Then I could go back to writing romances again, good, safe, romances. I dreamed again that night. Not of the crimes, but the killer himself. He leered at me, taunted me, tormented me with his wickedness. He bragged of his kill, in my story, and in reality. He boasted he'd kill again. And, he told me he'd come for me. I woke in a cold sweat. I know that's a cliché, but it's true. The bed sheets were soaked, and I was shaking. For a minute, I didn't know what to do. Was I still dreaming? Was it a reality? What would happen if I moved? Would he attack me? Then my mind leapt back to complete awareness. It was 5 in the morning. Too early to get up, but somehow, I did not want to go back to sleep. I compromised by moving to the sofa and reading till 7. The day turned out to be surprisingly busy. By the time I'd caught up with my editing, done all the busy work my accountant wanted and got in the groceries, it was getting toward evening. Well, late or not, I was going to finish that story and put this nightmare behind me. I knew this would be a struggle, so I started with a glass of scotch beside me. I segued quickly from his self-satisfied monologue and back to the action. The writing, and the story, seemed to race. Everything came out in a blur, identifying the victim, the stalking, the thrill of the chase, the capture, the time spent in the poor girl's psychological and physical abuse. He was even more sadistic this time, even more creative. He was vicious and terrible. But, was he? Or, is it me? I am the one, writing this. I stopped, pushed my chair back from my desk, and paced my study. I was the writer. He is my character. He is a well-written character, and I hate to think what his hideous nature means for me, the writer, But he is just a character. I am in control. I went to the window and opened it, letting in the cool night air. I leaned on the windowsill, noticing that my hands were trembling slightly. This was ridiculous, being shaken by my own creation. If I wanted to, I could delete the whole file, and he would have no shred of existence. Even better, I could make sure he suffered. I could write an ending that had him adequately punished for his evil. I grinned. That should tear him properly from my head. Refreshed and energized, I sat back at my keyboard. Now, let's see, how should I bring this creep to a terrible end? A trap. A brilliant trap, set by his enemies. I didn't want him to just get caught by the police or something. Oh no, I wanted him to suffer as he had made others suffer. Did that make me a bad person? No. I don't think so. The writing flowed again. He had what he thought was his next victim, in a house in a leafy suburb. No security, large yard, no dogs. The perfect setting, or so he thought. The writing started to flow again.
The killer parks a few houses away and walks toward his target. He doesn't want to disturb the victim. He walks slowly down the road, noticing the absence of cars, smiling to himself about his upcoming kill. He reaches the target house. The fence is tall, but there is a tree to hide his movement. He climbs over, dropping silently to the lawn on the other side.
I paused. My scotch was empty. I went to the shelf beside the window and refilled it. Idly, I looked out the window. The street was dark and empty. No cars were driving by this time of night. The only movement was the leaves of the big tree by my fence. I sat back at my keyboard. Time to bring him in closer to his victim.
He crosses the yard, silently in the darkness. All the while, he is running his hands over the tools in his bag, running his mind over how he's going to use them. He is so distracted that he doesn't see the branch on the lawn. He trips, grunting slightly, but quietly.
I thought I heard a noise from the yard. I almost rose to see what it was, but the story was flowing again. I didn't want to stop.
The killer reaches the house. There is just one light on the second floor. He doesn't want to take any chances though. It's an old house. A circuit board sits just inside the front porch. One flick of a switch, and the power goes off.
When the lights went out, I was pretty annoyed. Rolling power cuts were not uncommon around here this time of year, but they'd given us no warning this time. I sighed, had another sip at my scotch, and carried on with the story.
He pulls some of the tools out of his bag and starts on the door lock. He has the time. There can't be any sign of forced entry. He wants to leave the police as confused as possible. The lock clicks, and he pushes open the door. It lets out a long squeak.
I stopped, hands hovering over the keyboard. Two things had suddenly caught my attention. My computer, the old desktop, was still going even though the power seemed to be out. And I had heard a faint squeak of a door opening. This was impossible, wasn't it? Tentatively, I typed again, briefly. The killer stands at the front door. He lets out a whistle. Faintly I heard a whistle. I pushed my chair away from my desk, keeping my hands off the keyboard. This was madness, impossible. Had I drunk too much? What was happening? I listened as hard as I could. Nothing. But I knew what I'd heard earlier. Something had gone very wrong. I might be going crazy, but there was only one thing I could do. Briskly, I typed again. The killer vanishes. I waited. I strained to hear anything, to pick any one little noise that might indicate I wasn't alone in my house. I hoped I was. But what if I wasn't? I felt like I'd just awakened from a nightmare, but I wasn't sure I was really awake. I wanted to run to get out, but I was afraid that something would come for me if I made the slightest noise. I don't know how long it took before I realized that my PC was off. I felt like my brain slapped me in the face. Of course, it's off. The power is off. Had it really been on before? Had I really heard what I thought I had? It seemed unreal. Had I imagined it? Eventually, I worked up the courage to go downstairs. The front door was wide open, and the main breaker on the circuit board had tripped. I reset it. There was no other evidence that anything had happened. I couldn't shake my doubts, though. I felt I'd come really close to something terrible, no matter what my rational mind said. That's not what worries me the most, though. Did I somehow channel a real person, a natural killer? But, in that case, why would he stop? On the other hand, could I really have brought someone to life just by writing about him? Are we all only characters in someone else's writing? And if so, who is writing my story?